Okay, next up, Chris Taggart. You may know him from OpenCorporates, the website that collects all your companies. And he's going to talk about global open data, a threat or savior for democracy.
Okay, it's a little bit different subject than I talk about. Normally I'm talking about local data or corporate data, but I thought this is the second OKCon that I presented at, and it's the third one I've been to. And I think we need to, there were some big questions here. I haven't got answers, but I thought it was worth raising some of these questions. So just a little background, if I can get this thing to work. No, I'll do it like this. So my name is Chris Taggart. I count culture on Twitter. I developed a site called Openly Local in the UK, which scrapes council websites. Got about data on about 150, 160 councils, 10,000 councillors, about £12 billion worth of spending information. It's all open data. I also do a site called Open Charities, which opened up the charity register, and I'm on the panel that advises the government on opening up local data, along with Nigel Shadbolt and others. And I'm the co-founder and the CEO of OpenCorporates. CEO because we're trying to do this as a business. We're trying to be one of the first successful open data businesses. So, obviously it's been a fairly momentous year for democracy. Democracy in the widest sense, and particularly with the Arab Spring, but in other areas too. And when we're talking about democracy, in the light of the Arab Spring and all the stuff that's been happening, it's easy to get very optimistic and happy about what the future is. But I actually genuinely think that democracy at the moment is under threat, quite serious threat. And that's down, I think, mostly to three major issues, three major changes that are happening in the world. And mostly this is down to technology and the internet. The first, and I'm not the first person to say this, but the first is the way that technology and the internet is reducing friction. Massive reduction in friction. To the extent that we really don't know all the implications of this. In fact, we're just at the beginning in terms of understanding it. Because it's, the point about friction is that our lives, the world we see today is very much underpinned by a known amount of friction, a friction that we understand. The whole idea of intermediaries is a way that society has dealt with friction. From real estate agents and travel agents to electronic stores, recorded music industry, and they're very quickly being disintermediated. The whole concept of privacy is largely about the difficulty of combining information about yourself. And it's allowed us to live multiple lives, and also it's allowed our past to be forgotten. And that concept is becoming increasingly scarce. The other thing is that friction has allowed, gives incumbents great power, and allows multiple competitors to exist, multiple copies of the same industries to exist across countries. So both we've got incumbents existing and in industries existing in time and space. So this country will have the same industry multiplied essentially by as that one. Across time, you'll have slight shifts and so on, but essentially it's a fairly orderly progression. And increasingly we're seeing one monopoly provider per sector, and that's a global one as well. I don't think also people necessarily have always think about how much our democracies, as we understand it today, depend on friction. When you think about representative democracy is about friction. We don't decide instantly what we're going to do. We elect people for a given term and we can't do anything about that by and large until that term comes to an end. That's all about friction. When you think about the balance of power that most constitutional governments have, it's a balance between varying degrees of friction. The typical one in America, for example, you have different lengths of terms for the House, for the Senate, and for the Supreme Court. So it's about those different levels of friction give different balance of power. And actually, the issue of legislation, how we pass laws, is about friction. And that's actually a good thing. It's not, we've seen, particularly here in Germany, when it's easy to pass laws arbitrarily, when there isn't that friction, when there isn't that delay, when there isn't that sort of thing, then actually it's a bad thing. But that also poses a challenge, and I've been involved in a slight way in terms of legislation in the UK and drawing up the rules in the UK. And it's a genuinely difficult thing. How can you, when legislation takes from concept to being on the statute books, typically 2 years or often a lot more, how can you know what you should be doing when actually you don't even know what the world's going to be like, what you're legislating is going to be like in 2 years' time, never mind in 5, 10, 20 years' time that you'd hope the any legislation being passed would last for. And that's obviously critical when we're talking about IP, when we're talking about data, even open data. And we're also talking about regulating and legislation relating to failing industries. The corporate world, the world that most people live in, whether they're employed by somebody, deals with friction every day. Friction's about protecting incumbents. When you want to change your mobile phone provider, the fact that it's difficult is friction. And when the EU is trying to reduce that friction, allow it to make it easier, it's trying to reduce that friction. When you reduce friction inside a business, you can reduce the times of bringing things to market. Inditex, for example, which is Zara, I read something that I think it's something like about 15 days from deciding they're going to do something to design it and actually appearing in their shops. And the data is a key part of this. Government regulations, tax, all of this is a type of friction. And obviously many companies do their best to try and overcome this friction. Try to position themselves so that they don't pay that tax, that they don't have to be encumbered with that regulations, whether it's moving jurisdiction or whether it's lobbying to get these things removed. And we all know how the internet deals with friction. It treats it as a blockage, and it's something to be rooted around. And actually that's what the corporate world's been doing in many ways, and was a precursor, prefigured this idea of the internet architecture. If there's a blockage, it tries to find a way of rooting around it. And in the current days, the current world we live in, the ideas, data, money, there is very little friction involved there. The second key thing is the issue of jurisdictions. And jurisdictions, as we know them, are failing. Now, I talk about failure, not elimination. It's not that jurisdictions are being removed, but they're failing. What do we mean by jurisdiction when you can publish everywhere and nowhere at the same time? When we're talking about on the internet, where are we even talking about something being published? What do we mean by something like BP? In the US, when they had the Gulf War disaster, they talked about it as a British company, yet it's got more US than UK shareholders. Where's the jurisdiction? Where does the jurisdiction lie over Twitter, Facebook, or Baidu? How can you understand the company? How can you as a national government, as a tax office and tax inspectors understand a company, and when key parts are hidden in tax havens or the corporate structures are such that they are impossible to understand, impossible to inspect even, never mind understand. So often we see, and I think Richard Stallman touched on this earlier, we often see jurisdiction applied quite selectively. And in certain places and certain people. So high-earning people, it's very difficult to tax high-net-worth individuals. It's very difficult to tax big companies, but it's relatively easy to tax small companies and less wealthy individuals. ACTA, in a way, is a question of jurisdiction being applied quite selectively. And again, the corporate world understood this way before anyone else. Since the 19th century, there's been a race to the bottom as far as regulation and taxes goes. When New Jersey allowed the companies to be holding companies, essentially, and a whole load of companies suddenly moved to New Jersey. Finally, when we're talking about open data, what do we mean by jurisdiction? What should be the applicable law for a piece of open data that's published by the US government, let's say the SEC, for example. It's about a UK company, and it may refer to a German individual who should have jurisdiction in that issue. The fact that one government, one culture may consider it to be public data in the public domain, does that hold true for all of them? The final key factor, I think, that we're facing, that is affecting the way that we see the world and the way that the world is shaped and the way that we live in the world, is the power of data, and particularly low-friction data. There are three key issues, because it's not just a question of having data, it's the ability to use data, and I think this is what ultimately the open data movement's all about. And there are three main barriers here to using data: access, rights, and understanding. So first of all, can you get hold of the data? And that's not as simple or trivial an issue as it might seem. It's not just a question of whether you can get the data. If you're an incumbent, you want that data to protect your position as well. So you want to have it, and you want to stop other people having it. So you're quite happy to spend 100,000 euros on a data set because you're in an incumbent position, you can pass that to your customers. And actually, you're quite pleased to be able to spend 100,000 euros on it, because it means that small new companies can't afford that. It protects your position. Do you actually have the right to use this data? And by right to use this data, I mean properly use it. Combine it with other data, pass it on to others, work in a distributed, collaborative way. And actually also, do you understand the data? And do you have your systems or your processes such that they allow you to do something useful with it? And that's a big problem for governments, because despite the huge amount of data they hold, for them mostly they see data like this. It's essentially a bunch of files. They may be electronic, but essentially they may as well be paper. Sometimes, it's like this: an Excel spreadsheet, the lingua franca of the public sector. We've essentially got the same bureaucracies, the same processes as that we had when we were talking paper files, invented in the 19th century. The British Empire nicked most of it from the Chinese, and then used it to try and rule India and the other far-flung parts of the world that we essentially took over. And they work in this very siloed way as well. It's a question of this department, often in competition with each other, with no interest in sharing each other's data. And they've also been persuaded by history, by the idea of trying to have a public sector business model or whatever, to restrict access to the data to people for relatively trivial amounts. This actually is a warning notice that appears on the Illinois Company Register. They've actually passed a law to restrict people to reusing company data unless they sell it. They have to buy it and sell it, then you can do it, but actually you can't do it if you just want to give it to somebody. You're not allowed to give the Illinois data to somebody. Now, checking out this quote, there seems to be some issue about the provenance, whether it actually was Thomas Jefferson that said it, or Ralph Nader, or whoever. But I'm sure he would agree with it, the sentiment, except if he was alive today, he'd think he'd be saying that data is the currency of democracy. Open data, does it get us any further? Is it going to help us, or is it going to hinder it? I think it actually just gives the community a foothold. It's not a solution, but it gives the community a foothold, some skin in the game, as has been said. it's the open that's the critical part. It allows government to make the walls that separate it, those very hard walls that used to demarcate, you know, a council from the people that it represented, the government department from the wider community. It allows those to make those more permeable. It sort of it also allows government to retool itself, to take advantage of data, to remove those silos, and to end the culture of those big monolithic projects that government likes so much. And critically, when we're talking about global data, it allows it to straddle national boundaries. And when we're talking about the big issues of our time, the environment, economics, development, you know, the whole financial sector and the crisis that we've been through, you can't think about things that this key data in national terms. I don't believe it's a silver bullet. I don't believe silver bullets exist. It's what governments always try to do when they do these big monolithic projects. But it will help us. But that we have to get a few things right. With the wrong license, we'll be hobbled. Even if we have the right license, we're going to be outgunned and outspent. So we need powerful network effects. Actually, there are genuine risks in terms of having a data that understands data, having a government that understands data. Then there's the issue about where's the democratic oversight? You know, people like me who've got a certain amount of influence, done things. Where's the democratic influence over me? Over Digerati, over non-profits, over the Open Knowledge Foundation? Also, what about national cultural norms? How do those exist? You know, particularly privacy, when we've got things like the European farm subsidy data that is essentially taken down by a German court across the whole of EU. What are we doing there? You know, maybe we're just strengthening proprietary databases. So I'm going to whiz through this because there's not too much time. I know a lot about company data, I know a lot about corporate data, but I'm sure this is typical of other things, from meteorological data to geodata. It's not just true of corporate data. I'll try and whiz through this. Quickly, potted history of the company. It's worth just spending 30 seconds on this. It's not a natural thing. In fact, it's actually called, in many European cultures, they're actually called unnatural persons. And there's always been a tension between the corporate world and the state. This is Giovanni de' Medici, who set up the Medici Bank, which, again, had this, it was impossible to tell where the state and the corporate world ended. But then there was a critical point in the 19th century where governments all around the world decided to allow people to set up companies without having to pass an act of law. Mostly it was driven by the railroads, the need to raise money for the railroads. And they decided that because these things were so strange, were so unnatural, that they had to be registered and they had to publish information. That's when people started to hack the system. And using places like the Cayman Islands. Now, you know, when people talk about hackers, I think they miss the point about hackers. The best people about hackers, the best hackers in the world, absolutely without doubt, the most highly skilled hackers in the world, the best rewarded are corporate tax lawyers. It's about making the rules work for them. And with a new set of rules coming into existence, they figured out a way to game them. They have unlimited access to powerful tools, and cost is not a problem. They work in an agile way, highly focused, they're amoral, able to understand multiple systems and jurisdictions simultaneously. And best of all for them, they're pretty much untouchable. I mean, how many corporate tax lawyers get prosecuted each year? How many times has Deloitte been prosecuted? Because actually what they're doing is not illegal mostly. And if it is, it's difficult to prove it. So the idea of corporate balance of the companies has been, it's always been a bit of an unequal battle. Because companies used to look like this. And this is what share certificates used to look like. And this is what company reports used to look like. Actually, this is the point, that company reports, for most people, still look like this. Ironically, this is Dun & Bradstreet. If you get the Dun & Bradstreet Limited annual report from UK Companies House, this is what you get, a scan of a document, a scan of an image. And so that's one of the problems. There's a huge asymmetry of information, but particularly when we're talking about data, what's critical is that we've got an asymmetry of friction. For the governments, for community, for SMEs, for innovators. So is this really important? Does this matter? Does this affect people's lives? You know, when you start to look at what government information relates to companies, it's just huge amounts of stuff. Environmental data, spending data, prosecutions, licensing. It's just mind-boggling how much it is. But actually, this is what you've got when you look at that data. It's just some words together. It's literally words which may or may not match a company, but they never hold the company data. That's the important part. The reason why this is important is this is what creates the entity. This is what creates the legal entity, these company entries in the company register. I'm just going to do a really quick digression about the Duns number, because anyone who doesn't know about the Duns number, you really should know about the Duns number, because it is a terrifically clever bit of social engineering. Developed in '62 by Dun & Bradstreet, and they had this idea to basically create a monopoly ID system. You can read all about it. It boasts how it's a proprietary identification system. They basically get governments, particularly the US, around the world to use it, instead of the IDs that they created themselves, the company numbers. Then get them to integrate it really deeply into their systems and do the selling for you. This is an extract from the Federal Register, mandating, saying that everyone giving a grant, you can't give a grant to somebody that doesn't have a DUNS number. And then actually assert your IP so that this information can't be freely reused. Often when US government publishes federal data, they'll do it and they'll say it's been it's not including the DUNS number because we don't hold the, we're not allowed to release that. We don't hold the IP in that. It's been a pretty scary few years from a financial perspective, and you can't at one stage say actually the financial, the company, the corporate world doesn't affect us, and then have to bail it out for billions and billions of dollars. This actually, affects all of our lives in a really real way. Okay, I'm going to finish off now. I just want a quick 30-second whiz through OpenCorporates. And this, I think I've given some of the background why it's important. Basically, doing one thing, creating a URL for every company in the world. I kind of think of it as the grit inside the oyster that's generating the pearl. Once you've got that, you can attach all sorts of other things to it. Other people can use it to exchange information. So URL based on the company number. So it's not a monopoly ID. Anyone else could mirror it and use their own domain to do something. We've got a Google Refined Reconciliation endpoint so that you can easily match data, any data, using company names to actual real-world companies. We're collecting other data as well, whether it's SEC data, health and safety data, election data, and trademark data. It's all under the Open Database license. So I just want to end on 2 points, really. And it was useful and instructive to actually hear Richard speak this morning. And I nearly changed this penultimate slide to talk about free software rather than open source. Either way, I think basically they've been down this route before, and I think everyone in the open data community is learning about that we're increasingly mirroring what they did. It's all about the license. Everything else is trivial compared with a license. We already have pretty much a two-stage world. The data haves and the data have-nots. And actually in this world, government, the democratic institutions are in the have-nots. And I think that what this means in terms of the license, all public sector data should be under maximum of an attribution license. No more, not even share alike. And I think that all community data that people are building into the community, OpenStreetMap, whatever, OpenCorporates should be under attribution share alike data. That way we can build a community, we can build an open data sets, and we can actually start to redress the balance of power. Even then, given the issues we're facing to do with friction, maybe we'll end up with a different sort of democracy. You know, people talk about liquid democracy, people talk about all sorts of things. All of those scare me because, frankly, they're untested, and frankly, moving from one form of government to another rarely happens in a peaceful, orderly way. But I think that if we don't have open data, we won't have democracy. With open data, we've got a chance of doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We have 5 minutes for questions. Any questions? Over there.
On the OpenCorporate example, how do you see this evolving in terms of advocacy around the world? I mean, how essentially do you reckon that we will get, because it's a jurisdiction world and you have different norms around, and particularly register for companies are particularly difficult to get, and because there are legal issues around that. How do you see a movement evolving globally on this issue? What do you reckon? How do you foresee that?
Well, we've already been dealing with that question to a degree, in that we started off 6 months ago, December the 20th we launched. We'd been coding for about 6 weeks at that point. We started with something very basic, which is around about 3 million companies, just the UK, Jersey and Bermuda, almost a proof of concept. But the reason we've got 18 million companies now and 25 different jurisdictions is not through everything that we've been doing, it's actually through the open data community. We did a little bounty with Scraper Wiki, and do you know what? People are all the time coming up with, you can't do this except in a distributed way. You can't understand, how the Icelandic, register works, even with Google Translate and things like that. It's just too difficult to understand the things to do. We've pretty much cracked the Spanish one. We've got 1.7 million Spanish companies now. That was worked with entirely through a bit of knowledge I had, a bit of knowledge that a guy called David had, a bit of knowledge that someone called Mar had. We started combining it, and you do this. We've talked with people in government in Brazil. You can only do this through a distributed way. So we've had scrapers written, something like 20-odd scrapers written on Scraper Wiki. Someone did India. Suddenly we had 1 million companies in India for doing. Now that's not to say that there aren't legal issues, but the practical issues, to a degree, can only be solved through distributing the problem to different people. And ultimately, you can even, there are ways of doing this, going to people's websites and saying, okay, let me cut and paste, let me crowdsource this. There are ways around getting this, but I would be lying if I didn't say it's a problem, but it's one that we definitely can't solve on our own, but we can help be a focal point helping the open data community solving that, if that answers the question.
Okay, we have one other question. Please keep it short.
I just wondered if you've thought about expanding this out to non-corporate bodies such as universities, which, you've talked about open charities, but how about other non-corporate bodies?
Yes and no. We briefly thought about it, but decided not to. Actually, some of the universities are companies or have companies, and so the question was, what is a company? And we decided that it was, and this is a typical sort of computing science thing. A company is something that's registered as a company by a company register, because actually it's different in different areas. Some charities are also companies. Some, and some organisations, some societies, some government institutions are companies. So we've just decided to do that. I think there's a need for for another website to be mapping out public sector institutions or pseudo-public sector institutions as well, non-departmental public bodies, quangos, whatever you want to call it, universities, schools and things like that. But I think that's a different site. There may be places where we've got data and where we exchange the data, where we say it's also the same as this, but I think that's another site. We can't do that, and I don't think we should. I don't want us to be the one site for everything. I just want us to be the site that helps solve company problems in an open way.
Okay, thank you. A round of applause for Chris Taggart.